Hey, welcome back to the channel, I missed you. So for people that don't play the Combat Flight and Armored Vehicle Simulator, War Thunder, also there's ships in it too, but we don't talk about naval. If they know anything about the game at all, they probably only know of the myriad of classified documents leaks that have happened on the forums and subreddit. Since 2021, there have been 13 confirmed cases of classified military documents being leaked, though I'll readily admit that number can be kinda misleading, since some of the documents, they aren't outright classified, as some are only export restricted, which to my understanding means that they're technically declassified domestically, but are restricted from being shared internationally. But to be honest, I don't really understand how this works, and that's not the point of this video anyways. I know of a few people who have gone through every instance where these documents were leaked, and I've even seen Moist Critical briefly touch on the subject during the Thug Shaker Central debacle earlier in 2023, so I'll just let those speak for themselves. For this video though, I more wanted to talk about why exactly this happens from the perspective of someone who has been playing this game pretty religiously for almost 8 years now, as opposed to just going through bullet points of each instance. As always, please make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. I've really been enjoying making content this past year, and I'm striving to do it more in 2024 and to grow my channel, and I would really appreciate it if anyone wants to come along for the ride. So with that being said, let's get into the video. So my War Thunder journey begins in 2016. It's the summer after my freshman year of college. I'm home for the summer without anything to really do. I didn't have a summer job, all of my college friends were in the northern part of my state, whereas I lived in the central region, and it was anywhere between a 2 and 5 hour drive depending on I-95 traffic. If you know, you know. I needed something to do, and I didn't really have any money, plus my main computer was my 2015 MacBook Pro that I had gotten for college, so most games were just out of the question. I didn't even really have the money to buy something like Minecraft. It seemed like I was out of luck until I stumbled across some gameplay footage on my Instagram of a World War II era combat flight simulator. And it reminded me of the days where I desperately would try to get my copy of IL-2 Sturmovik that I had bought from a middle school book fair to run on my parents' PC, to no avail. The game, as it turns out, was War Thunder, and when I looked it up, much to my surprise, it was free. And it could run on my Mac. It was almost too good to be true, and I was hooked immediately, and I have been ever since. Something important to note as to why this game has such a die-hard fan base is that it really doesn't have anything resembling direct competition in its field. The closest games that it has in competition are Wargaming's World of Tanks and World of Warplanes, but those games are so fundamentally different that, apart from the subject matter, there's very little overlap in actual gameplay. World of Tanks and World of Warplanes are more arcade-based, so where your vehicle and every other vehicle have a certain amount of hit points, and whenever you run out of hit points, your vehicle is destroyed. War Thunder, on the other hand, is modular, so if your engine or your transmission is taken out, your tank is immobile and you have to repair it before you can move again, but the gun still works. And if your cannon barrel or your breech is taken out, you can still move, but you can't fire until you repair them. And each crew member is modeled and your vehicle's performance is affected as they're taken out. Your ammunition count is also limited, and if you run out, that's it until you can return to your airfield for air battles or to a friendly capture point for ground battles to reload. Furthermore, certain things such as armor protection and flight performance are all decently well modeled, all things considered. So within War Thunder, the vehicles are separated into 10 tech trees, each one representing a different nation's vehicles. There's the United States, Germany, the Soviet Union/Russia, the United Kingdom, Italy, Japan, Sweden, China, and France, and most recently Israel. Furthermore, the vehicles are represented in those tech trees. They're sorted by a battle rating system, so the less capable or advanced a vehicle is, the lower its battle rating will be, and the more advanced you go, the higher the battle rating. This generally tends to follow with the eras each of the vehicles were active in, but there's still some pretty big exceptions. For example, Italy has a self-propelled anti-air vehicle from the 1980s that sees tanks from World War II. The battle ratings range from 1.0 to 12.3 for aircraft, and from 1.0 to 11.7 for ground vehicles. Each vehicle is assigned a battle rating that ends in either 0.0, 0.3, or 0.7, and within each match, there's a maximum spread of one whole number in battle rating. So, for example, If you're playing a vehicle with a 5.7 battle rating, you can see enemies as low as 4.7 and as high as 6.7, but never within the same match. And this is done to prevent pre-World War II vehicles from seeing modern era vehicles that they have absolutely no hope of defeating. So when I first started playing, I pretty much exclusively played aircraft. The highest battle rating at the time was 9.0, and the newest aircraft that had been introduced were the British Hawker Hunter, which entered service into the Royal Air Force in 1954, and the Soviet Mikoyan Gurevich MiG-17, which entered into service with the Soviet Air Force in October of 1952. Ground battles were kind of an afterthought, and tanks were still decently new into the game at the time, but I believe that the highest tier vehicles at that time were the Soviet IS-4 heavy tank, which entered production in 1946, the German Maus super heavy tank, which was a prototype from the end of World War II, never entered service and has since been removed from the tech tree, though if you already had it when it was removed, you can still play it, and the American M103 heavy tank, which entered service in 1957. As the game has progressed, newer and newer vehicles have been added to it, and as of the latest update in December of 2023 when I'm writing the script for this video, the highest tier aircraft are the American McDonnell Douglas F-15A, the General Dynamics F-16 Block 50, and the Grumman F-14B, as well as the Russian MiG-29 SMT and the Sukhoi Su-27. For ground vehicles, it's much more diverse, with each nation getting essentially the main battle tank, or MBT for short, that they currently field today, as well as other lighter infantry fighting vehicles and anti-air vehicles. So it's here that a big problem starts to arise, and where these classified document leaks start to make a little more sense. You see, in order for these vehicles to be properly modeled into the game, the developers over at Gaijin Entertainment have to rely on historical documentation regarding engine performance, firepower, armor thickness, flight performance, and some other things like countermeasures and active protection systems. Now, this wasn't a problem in years past, as since the vehicles were so old, most, if not all, of the technical documentation on them had already been declassified and were readily and publicly available. Furthermore, as things started to get more complicated and new mechanics were added, such as guided missiles, countermeasures, composite armor, explosive reactive armor, high explosive anti-tank or heat rounds, armor-piercing fin stabilized discarding sabot, or APFSDS rounds. That's a mouthful, I know. But documentation around them becomes a lot more muddied, and for many of the vehicles that are still in active service today, a lot of the documentation on them is still classified, so Gaijin just kind of has to guesstimate certain performance values, which leads to yet another problem that contributes itself to the classified documents leaking. Gaijin Entertainment was founded and is currently led by brothers Anton and Kirill Yudintsev, both from Russia. And while Gaijin's headquarters is in Budapest, Hungary, make no mistake, they're a Russian company through and through. The decision to base their company in Hungary might be for tax reasons, as well as to make it easier to market the game within Europe, but I'm not entirely sure about specifics, so that's not a hill I'm willing to die on, and if anyone wants to correct me in the comments, please feel free to do so. Gaijin claims they do not have any connection to Moscow whatsoever anymore, and while I'm definitely inclined to believe them, the decisions of Gaijin regarding balancing, new additions, and bug reports seem to heavily favor Russia, and I'll delve a bit more into detail, but it should be noted that this really mainly applies for ground vehicles, and as such, I'm going to spend the majority of the rest of this video on that. For aircraft, it's definitely more balanced towards top tier, and if anything, it tends to favor the United States. Like when the F-14A was introduced in 2022, it had absolutely no competition, and it just stomped everything. Now, this kind of goes against Gaijin's usual operating procedure of anytime there is a new top tier vehicle that will change the meta, they'll usually introduce a vehicle to the US tree, a competitor to the Russian tree, and maybe a distant third to a minor nation. I am 99% certain that this wasn't the case with the F-14A because it was rushed out to capitalize on the hype from Top Gun Maverick, but this is little more than a tinfoil hat conspiracy theory. Now, one thing I deliberately haven't mentioned yet is that ground battles are not limited to one spawn of a vehicle. It's not exactly a team deathmatch, but rather each player can create a lineup of vehicles to use, and there's no limit to how many vehicles can be in one lineup provided that the player has enough crew slots for them. Furthermore, players are not limited to just ground vehicles, as they can and often do include planes and, in higher tiers, helicopters to act as close air support. Now, close air support in this game is already a touchy subject, and I am not touching that topic with a 10-foot pole, but going off of this, and given the spread of battle ratings possible to see at top tier, the largest lineup of strictly ground vehicles varies wildly from nation to nation. For the United States, that number is 12, which includes premium vehicles that are currently available for purchase, but doesn't include event vehicles that can only be bought on the marketplace. For Germany, this number is 6, for Sweden it's 7, and some nations have it even worse, with my main nation of France having only 5, Italy only having 6, and Japan also only having 5. Russia has 8, but this doesn't exactly paint a full picture, as many of their vehicles punch well above their weight class. For instance, the 2S38, a premium light vehicle with an auto-loading 57mm cannon that has a fire rate of 120 rounds per minute, sits at just 10.0, and it is absolutely busted. I shamelessly own this thing, and it's like playing on easy mode. Gaijin also balances their vehicles and assigns the battle ratings based solely off of player statistics. Granted, they deny that they do this and claim that they instead take a variety of different factors into consideration, with player statistics being only a small factor, but they haven't provided any evidence to suggest this, and some players from another YouTuber, Defin Squadron, have pretty definitively debunked Gaijin's claim, where they found a vehicle that was already pretty over-tiered and just got super cracked at it, and they single-handedly got the battle rating of it raised. I could go on and on about examples of certain vehicles that are over-tiered or under-tiered, and about the battle rating compression and power creep in the game. Maybe I'll do that in another video if there's enough interest, but the main takeaway that I'd like to emphasize is that these methods tend to benefit Russia, or Eastern Bloc vehicles as a whole, a pretty hefty majority of the time, at least in higher tiers. I mean, currently, Russia is stomping in top tier ground, and they have been for a while, mainly due to shady balancing practices, the fact that Russian teams at top tier, even if the enemy team is just mowing them down wave after wave, can just keep spawning. It becomes a bit of a numbers game, and that game tends to favor Russia. Also, and the main reason I'm about to get to regarding the classified documents leaks, is that the documentation that Gaijin accepts regarding vehicle performance overwhelmingly favors Russia, to the point where Russian vehicles are pretty reliably overperforming, while native vehicles are reliably underperforming and aren't really represented to their full potential. So as I mentioned previously in this video, in order to recreate these vehicles in-game as accurately as possible, Gaijin relies on technical documentation in order to make their decisions as to how each vehicle is going to be modeled. This wasn't really a big problem early on, as most, if not all, of the vehicles that were present in-game from pre-World War II up to the Korean War are no longer in active service, and all of their documentation has been declassified and is readily available for the public. Even then, there was quite a bit of speculation about Russian bias in the game, and that some of their sourcing regarding Soviet vehicles were a bit dubious, which sparked players to create the meme of "secret documents, comrade," and Russian armor being made of stellinium. These were jabs that Gaijin would even join in on from time to time, but for the most part, the idea of heavy Russian bias was more of a meme than anything else, and the game was still pretty well balanced, all things considered. And that still stands true to this day. The World War II era is one of the most balanced areas of the game, in my opinion, and as a result is one of the most fun. There's a common saying in the War Thunder community of low tier, fun tier, and this is mostly where it stems from. In fact, if there's any faction in the game that kind of gets their hand held in this era, it's Germany, but that's a topic for a different video. However, the devs at Gaijin fully and readily admit that they don't always get it right 100% of the time, and are pretty open to being proven wrong in this regard, at least in theory. As such, there's a section on the War Thunder forums where players can submit bug reports regarding overall vehicle performance, and provided that the player supports their report with appropriate documents, The forum moderators will pass on the report to the developers, and from there the report will hopefully be implemented in the game. Now, I'm not entirely sure what the official requirements are for documentation in order to submit bug reports. It used to be listed quite clearly on the old forums, but after those forums were shut down and the new forums opened in the wake of the review bombing revolution of this year, you know, the event that kind of put my channel on the map, I'm having more trouble finding it. I believe it's something like either 3 primary sources or 1 primary source and 2 secondary sources. I'm not entirely sure. However, it's really up to the moderators of the forums as to whether or not the documents are acceptable to be taken into consideration, and there are some wild inconsistencies in this department that, yet again, heavily favor Russia. For example, I remember some time ago that a bug report was submitted for the 2S38, that light tank I mentioned earlier, saying that its turret rotation speed in game was slower than it should be. There was no source given whatsoever. And the moderators passed the report on to the developers, and it was implemented with no questions asked. On the other hand, there's a pretty comparable vehicle in the US tech tree, the High Survivability Test Vehicle Lightweight, or HSTVL for short. That was a test bed for US light tanks in the late 1970s that never entered production. As far as in-game performance goes, it's pretty comparable to the 2S38. However, it sits a whole 1.3 battle ratings higher than the 2S38, at 11.3 as opposed to the 2S38's 10.0, despite the HSTVL having a full second longer reload time, fewer shell choices, and worse armor protection everywhere except for on the rear, though both these being light tanks, this is kind of a moot point. On one hand, the HSTVL is marginally faster than the 2S38, and its APFSDS round has about 50 millimeters more penetration on flat armor at point-blank range, but I'd say that evens it out if anything. To make matters worse, there are quite a few things that the HSTVL does not have modeled in game that it did have in real life, such as space in the turret for a full 60 rounds. Though it only carried 26 in its test drives, it's still not that much of a stretch to assume that if it had the space allotted for 60 rounds, it would probably be able to carry 60 rounds. And furthermore, the HSTVL also had the ability to track planes as well, a feature it does not have in game, but the 2S38 conveniently does. Now, it's not like primary sources on the HSTVL don't exist or are even hard to come by. One of the biggest War Thunder YouTubers, one of my favorites, and among the most well-respected content creators in the War Thunder community, Spookston, has submitted countless bug reports on the HSTVL, and his case is even more of a special one as he has a more direct line of contact with Gaijin than most players do. But it still isn't enough. The forum moderators just do not care, and will not listen no matter how many sources he provides and how valid and reliable those sources are. And it seems like, as time goes on, Gaijin is jumping through more and more hoops in their seemingly never-ending mental gymnastics to justify not accepting these sources. The point that I mentioned earlier about the ammo quantity would almost be a valid one, as like if the vehicle never carried that much ammo in real life, it would make sense that this was reflected in game, but the problem lies in the inconsistency as to when and where Gaijin decides to apply these rules and where they look the other way. Like for instance, the Yakovlev Yak-141, a late Cold War Soviet jump jet prototype that sits at 12.0 in the Russian tech tree, never entered production. It only had 4 airframes produced, and only 2 of those airframes ever actually flew. There were plans for the production version of the aircraft to have pretty run-of-the-mill features for fighter jets at that time, such as radar, TV weapons guiding, and heads-up display. But the Soviet Union fell apart and the project lost funding before these could ever be tested or implemented. However, despite all of this, the Yak-141 is still modeled in game with all of its weaponry and with the radar, which kind of flies right in the face of their earlier reasoning to not include the HSTVL's fully planned ammo loadout in the game. Most recently though, the player's main focus has been on the most modern MBTs, namely the M1A2 SEP V2 or System Enhancement Package. The SEP V2 was the latest iteration of the Abrams V introduced into the game, only being introduced in December of 2023. Now, the biggest selling point for the SEP V2 as opposed to the baseline M1 Abrams is the addition of better sights, better commander controls, and the addition of depleted uranium armor. The latter greatly enhances its protection from the front. Quite a few bug reports have been submitted regarding the effectiveness of the depleted uranium armor, but since this iteration of the Abrams didn't begin production until the 1990s and is still being used today, a lot of the specifics regarding its performance is still classified, though there is a good amount of documentation that has already been provided by players showing that it does, in fact, increase its overall protection on both the hull and the turret, albeit not specifically how much. Despite all of the evidence to support the players' claims, Gaijin has come up with excuse after excuse to justify not implementing the protection enhancements. At the same time, like I mentioned earlier, the existence of this depleted uranium armor is very well documented, and it's reflected in a significant increase in the tank's overall weight. This weight increase is in fact modeled into the game, which, if implemented correctly, would be a decent trade-off. The tank becomes slower, but it also becomes stronger. But Gaijin instead modeled only the weight increase, ignoring any possible reason as to why this weight increase might have taken place. The armor protection values are still the same as other Abrams variants in the game, and this is not exclusive to the Abrams. It's pretty much present in every NATO or NATO-aligned MBT that has multiple variants in the game, like the British Challenger and the French Leclerc, for example. And with 5 NATO members represented in the game and a possible 6th whenever Sweden's finally confirmed into NATO, this represents a good portion of top-tier ground players. Alright, so 2 final examples of Gaijin's inconsistencies regarding bug reports, and then I'll try to wrap this video up. I know it's already long. The French Leclerc MBT currently has 4 variants represented in game. Just a little while ago, a player submitted a bug report stating that the armor protection of the Leclerc was misrepresented in the game, and it should be better than it currently is. The player provided 2 sources confirming this, one from trials conducted by Sweden and one from trials conducted by Russia. Forum moderators rejected these sources because they claimed that both were unreliable. So, NATO-aligned sources are unreliable, and Russian sources are unreliable. It's just an uphill battle that the players just cannot win, and this is by design. The last example I'd like to get to introduces a whole new concept that I haven't mentioned yet, and that's the concept of spalling. Essentially, when any thick piece of metal is bent, penetrated, or disfigured due to, I don't know, say, another tank's round hitting it, the metal starts to splinter as it bends or breaks, sending shards of metal hurtling through the inside of the vehicle, posing a significant hazard to the crew members of the tank that got hit. It's gonna ruin your day. Not only do Russian MBTs seem to generate very little spall when hit, but pretty much all modern MBTs, both Russian and NATO, are fitted with spall liners to mitigate this threat. It's essentially a lining on the inside of the armor that's meant to catch some of that spall before it can pose a danger to the crew inside. Now, different MBTs had this implemented in different ways, and when the T90M was first announced in a dev blog for the most recent major update, which went live on December 14th, it was originally going to be the only tank in the game with a spall liner modeled. Thankfully, this received enough backlash from the community that Gaijin admitted that they already had spall liners for other nations ready to go and would be implemented along with the T90M's liner, but one specific NATO MBT was suspiciously missing from this list. Can you guess which one it is? That's right, the Abrams. Now, the United States, being the most well-funded military in the world, and it not really being remotely close, has implemented spall liners on the Abrams. The key difference there is that instead of simply being on the inside of the tank, the spall liner is sandwiched between the armor plates. When confronted with this, the forum moderators responded and said, "Oh, there's no way for us to confirm this. Maybe if someone sent us a picture of an armor cutout, then maybe, I don't know." That information is classified, and Gaijin pretty forwardly is requesting people to leak them. Now, I don't know, maybe I'm assuming too much, or maybe I'm reading too far into Gaijin's intentions and I'm going a bit too hard on them, but I mean, this is perhaps the most direct instance of this, but this is the main point I'm getting at and how I would like to conclude this video. So, this video is already way longer than I meant it to be, my apologies, but I wanted to do as thorough of a job as I could of explaining the why of all of these documents leaks. Looking at the Wikipedia page for the confirmed list of leaks so far, a list that is ever growing, of the 13 leaks listed, only 4 of them were for non-NATO aligned vehicles, 2 of those being Chinese vehicles, only 1 of those actually being in the game, and the other 2 being Russian, with, again, only 1 of those being in the game. The reason why this keeps happening, and the reason why it will probably continue to happen, is because it seems like no amount of diligent legal research seems to be enough for Gaijin to implement any sort of positive change for any Western aligned vehicles. So at the end of the day, we have a game that is already divided into national factions and is being skewed due to national ties, whether Gaijin acknowledges it or not. As such, Russian vehicles tend to be overperforming, whereas NATO vehicles are not performing as well as they should be, pretty much across the board. Add all of those moving parts together, you get certain players that care so deeply about this game that they are willing to go to any lengths necessary to have their favorite vehicles perform correctly, and thus you get classified documents leaked. And honestly, at this point, I do kind of wonder if it's not at least partially intentional. I've been seeing some people in the subreddit speculating about that, and honestly, it wouldn't be surprising in the slightest if it were true. But I don't know. What do you all think? Let me know in the comments. Alright, well that about does it for this video. I know it was a long one, but I've had a lot of thoughts on this subject for the past couple of months, and I wanted to get them out somewhere. For those of you that do play War Thunder regularly and are also frustrated about the situation right now, for those of you who might be newer to the game and want to know about what all the fuss is about this time, it will happen again, trust me. Or for those of you who don't play at all and want to know why the hell you keep hearing about this game leaking classified documents all the time. As always, thank you all so much for watching. Please be sure to leave a like and subscribe, and let me know if you want to see more videos like this or about other stuff in general. I have a lot of things to say about a lot of stuff, so stick around if that sounds fun. I really want to make more videos in 2024, like I mentioned earlier, and to try to grow my channel along with that, so I'd love it if you all wanted to join me for the ride. And with that, I think we're done here.